The lieutenant is dead before the second RPG hits, and the 11 Marines left in the wadi below root copper understand. In the space of about 4 seconds, that the only voice standing between them and a night with no name is a woman back at the outpost that everyone on base calls, without unkindness, 200 meters up the comms tower from where those 11 men press themselves into wet gravel and dead reeds. June Halloran sets down her coffee mug, adjusts the gain on a radio that has just erupted with the ragged, overlapping voices of young men trying not to sound as frightened as they are, and says 4 words into the handset that will change everything about how this outpost remembers her. Copy your contact, Reaper 6. Captain Bram Tice, the night watch officer, crosses the operations center in 6 strides and puts his hand flat on the comms desk between June and the radio, telling her, not asking, telling her to stand down and let a certified fire support controller take the handset. Unhurried patience of someone who has been told to stand down by better men than him in far worse places, and simply keeps talking to the wadi. The dust storm had rolled in from the western desert 2 hours before sunset, a wall of ochre haze that swallowed the ridgelines and grounded every rotor on the airfield, and by the time First Lieutenant Grant Osei led Second Squad's 12-man patrol down into the wadi to check a culvert that had been flagged for possible IED activity, nobody at Outpost Larkspur knew that the insurgent element watching that culvert had been waiting 3 days for exactly this weather. The ambush came from both flanks at once, PKM fire-raking the low ground where the patrol had no choice but to seek cover. And within the first 90 seconds, OC took a round through the chest plate that the plate could not stop. And the patrol's radio operator, a private first class barely 5 months out of the School of Infantry, made the single correct decision of his young life. He keyed the handset and called for anyone at all to answer. The person who answered was not supposed to be the person who answered. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. June Halloran was 51 years old, a civilian contractor with a laminated badge that said Communications Specialist in blue block letters. And for the 14 months she had worked the night desk at Outpost Larkspur. Condescending little story about her, without ever asking her a single real question. She was the woman who made the coffee at 0300 when nobody else was awake to make it. She was the woman who logged the routine traffic and filed the after-action reports nobody read. She was, in the words of one Lance Corporal, who did not know she was standing behind him when he said it, basically radiogrammer, and the nickname had stuck the way careless nicknames do, worn smooth by repetition until nobody remembered it was ever meant to be cruel, which somehow made it worse. She wore a contractor fleece over civilian slacks, kept her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a simple clip, and drank her coffee black from a chipped white mug with a faded eagle on the side. And in 14 months, not one person at Larkspur had asked her what she had done before she came here. Because nobody imagines that the tired-looking woman refilling the coffee pot at 0300 used to be anyone at all. What none of them knew, what she had never once mentioned, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of a long habit of not needing anyone's approval, was that June Halloran had spent 11 years as an active-duty fire support coordinator, the specialist who sits at the crossroads of every artillery battery, mortar section, and close air support asset in a fight and turns chaos into grid coordinates. And that, in the last 2 years of that career, she had built a reputation so specific, so total, that Marines, who had never met her, still knew her call sign the way altar boys know a saint's name. The recordings of her voice from a 3-day siege a decade earlier, clipped, unhurried, utterly without panic, even as the position she was supporting took 40% casualties, had been transcribed, studied and taught in fire support schoolhouses to a generation of Marines who came up believing the call sign belonged to someone retired or dead, or possibly apocryphal, a kind of professional ghost story about the gold standard of composure under fire. Vesper, that was the call sign. And the woman sitting at the night desk at Outpost Larkspur, in her fleece and her hair clip, sipping black coffee at 0300 and getting mistaken for someone's tired aunt, was Vesper, and had been for longer than most of the Marines currently pinned in that wadi had been alive. When the private first class's voice broke through the static, any station, this is Reaper 13. We are in contact, we have 1K IA. Requesting immediate support. Over. June set down her mug without spilling it, which was its own kind of tell if anyone had been watching her hands instead of her face. And she picked up the handset with the specific economical motion of someone who has done this exact thing more times than she could count and never once forgot how. Reaper 13, this is Larkspur Actual on this net. Be advised, air is grounded for weather. QRF is currently blocked at the wash crossing, estimate delay of at least 30 mics. She said, her voice even unhurried, carrying none of the alarm that was rippling through the operations center around her. I need your position. I need a head count. And I need to know who has command down there right now. Over. There was a long pause, filled with gunfire and someone screaming a name that wasn't going to get an answer. And then a different, younger voice came on, ragged with an effort at control that was only partly succeeding. Larkspur, this is Corporal Redmond. I have the patrol. Lieutenant Ose is down. He's gone, ma'am. He's gone. We have 12 packs total, including one more wounded. We are pinned in the wadi 300 meters south of the culvert, taking fire from the north tree line. 12 men. 1 dead, Lieutenant. A corporal who sounded like he had aged 5 years in the last 2 minutes, now the ranking Marine in a kill zone with darkness coming on fast and the wind screaming outside, carrying enough grit to blind a helicopter pilot at 50 feet, even if one had been willing to fly in it. June closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Not in prayer, not in doubt, but in the old practiced act of clearing every unnecessary thought out of her head the way she had trained herself to do a decade before most of these Marines had learned to read a map. The way a chess player sees the board, 4 moves ahead before the opponent has finished their first move. Corporal Redmond, this is Larkspur. I hear you, and I need you to hear me, she said. You are the ranking Marine on that radio, and that makes you the patrol leader as of right now, whether you feel ready for it or not. I'm going to walk you through everything 1 step at a time, and you are going to do exactly what I tell you, in the order I tell you. And by morning, I'm going to get all 12 of your Marines home. Do you copy that? Over. Somewhere behind Redmond's voice, a young man was making a sound that wasn't quite words. And somewhere else, a weapon was firing in short, disciplined bursts that told June at least one Marine down there still had his wits fully about him. I copy Larkspur, Redmond said. Copy all. Who is this? Over. Someone who is going to keep you alive. June said. "Now get your Marines flat, get accountability, and tell me what you can see." Captain Dramatized arrived at the comms desk roughly 90 seconds later, alerted by the watch NCO that the night desk contractor had apparently taken over primary traffic on an active troops in contact situation, and what he found was a 51-year-old woman in a fleece jacket calmly issuing what sounded to his trained ear disturbingly like fire support guidance to a corporal who had no business receiving it from anyone without a current qualification card. Tice had 11 years in the Marine Corps himself, 4 of them as an operations officer, and he prided himself, not without reason, on running a tight watch floor. He did not know June Halloran's history, because nobody had ever told him, because her personnel file, the actual one, sat in a record system 3 commands removed from Larkspur under a name and a set of details. To Dramatized, in this moment, June Halloran was an unqualified civilian who had grabbed the handset during the worst possible 5 minutes to grab a handset. And every instinct he had told him to shut this down immediately. "Halloran, step away from the desk," he said, his hand coming down flat on the counter between them, not touching her, but close enough to make the point. "I need a certified controller on this net, not—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the shape of it hung there anyway, "not you." June did not look away from the radio. "Captain, with respect, in about 90 seconds, that patrol is going to need someone to walk them through a movement to cover using terrain nobody in this operation center has ever set foot on. And I have that terrain memorized down to the drainage cuts. You can relieve me the second you find someone who has that, and until then, I am going to keep talking to Corporal Redmond, because right now, I am the only reason 12 men know where north is." She said it without hate, without defiance, the way a surgeon might tell an orderly to hand her the instrument and stop asking questions. And something about the flatness of her certainty made Tice hesitate in a way that surprised him. "This is not protocol," he said. "No," June agreed. "It isn't. Neither is losing 12 Marines, because the book says only the person with the current card gets to talk. Corporal Redmond, say again your last over." Tice stood there for 3 more seconds, his jaw working, the entire weight of 11 years of doing things the correct way pressing against the plain fact that he had no better plan and no time to build one. Told the watch NCO to get him the outpost commander on the landline and let her keep talking. What followed over the next 6 hours was not in any way a Hollywood film would recognize. There were no explosions framed like fireworks, no slow-motion heroics, no single decisive moment that resolved the crisis in an instant. What there was, instead, was a woman at a desk with a headset clamped over gray-streaked hair, working through a night with the patient, relentless precision of someone assembling a watch out of components too small for most people to see. And every one of those components was a life. The first thing June needed was the ground truth, and she built it the way she had built ground truth 100 times before in places with worse names than this one. Not by asking Redmond what he thought was happening, but by asking him what he could specifically see, hear, and confirm. "Corporal, I don't want your opinion. I want your eyes," she told him. "Tell me exactly what terrain is between your position and the culvert. Over." And when he started to describe it in the vague, adrenaline-scrambled language of a young man who had never had to give a terrain brief in his life, she stopped him gently, but without wasting a word. and gave him the shape of it herself. Because she had walked that wadi in daylight 2 years earlier during a joint patrol nobody at Larkspur remembered she'd been part of, and she had never once, in 30 years of doing this work in one uniform or another, forgotten a piece of ground she had walked. There's a dry drainage cut running roughly northeast to southwest, about 40 meters behind your position, cuts down about 1.5 meters. It'll give you defilade from the tree line if you can get bodies into it without exposing yourselves crossing the open ground between, she said. I need you to tell me if that matches what you're seeing. Over. A pause, and then Redmond's voice quieter. The specific quiet of someone realizing the person on the other end of this radio knows something they have no business knowing. That's a match, Larkspur. How did you focus on your Marines, Corporal? Not on me, June said. I need you to move in pairs. Low crawl the first 10 meters where you're most exposed to the eastern berm. Then you can move in a crouch. Who's your most experienced Marine after you? Over. That'd be Lance Corporal Vance, ma'am. But he's hit. Took a fragment in the thigh from the first RPG. He's still talking. He's still with us, but he's not going to be doing any crawling over. June had already built Ollie Vance into her mental map of the night before Redmond finished the sentence, because a wounded Marine who was still lucid and still talking was, in the brutal calculus of a night like this one, both a liability to be protected and an asset she could use. Someone who could report on conditions from a fixed position while the rest of the patrol moved. A second set of eyes she could triangulate against Redmond's. Copy. Keep him on this radio when you can spare a hand for it. I want a status check on him every 15 minutes starting now. He's my clock for tonight. Lance Corporal Vance, if you can hear this, I need a sound off. Over. A weak voice came through, breathing hard, trying for steadiness and mostly finding it. I'm here, ma'am. Bleeding's controlled. Tourniquets on. I'm good to talk over. Good man, June said, and meant it in a way that went beyond the professional courtesy of the phrase, because she had learned a long time ago that the wounded Marine who keeps talking on the radio is doing more for the unit's survival than almost anyone else in the kill zone, and that the kindest thing she could do for him was give him a job. You're my timekeeper tonight, Lance Corporal. Every 15 minutes, you're going to key this net and give me a number and your status. That's your mission until sunrise. Can you do that for me? Over. Copy, Larkspur. It was 1912 hours when that exchange happened, a fact June noted in the log in front of her with the same steady hand she used for everything else that night. And it was 1912 hours that would become, over the following 10 hours, the first entry in a chain of whispered time checks that would mark the night's low. Brutal passage almost more clearly than the gunfire did. 1927, Vance's voice a little weaker. The patrol had moved 8 meters into the drainage cut. 1943, Vance reporting 3 Marines now returning fire in short, controlled bursts to keep the Eastern Burns shooters honest. The dust storm still screaming outside the outpost's own walls 2 kilometers away, meaning the air wing remained grounded, and meaning June's promise to Redmond about air support was for now a promise she could not keep and did not pretend she could. This was the first hard truth of the night, and June delivered it the way she delivered every hard truth, directly, without softening it into something false. Corporal Redmond, I want you to hear this clearly, because I'm not going to sugarcoat it, she said, somewhere around 2015 hours, after Captain Tice had gotten off the landline with the outpost commander and returned to hover uneasily at the edge of the comms desk. Air is grounded. QRF is still blocked at the wash crossing, because the same storm that's grounding air has turned that low ground into something their vehicles can't cross safely in the dark. And that means for the next several hours, the only fire support you are going to have is what I can bring you from the mortar section here at Larkspur. And the only guidance you are going to have is my voice. That is the whole math. And it is a hard math, and I need you to trust it anyway. Over. There was a silence on the other end that lasted 4 full seconds. Long enough that June could picture, without needing to see it, the young corporal absorbing the actual shape of his situation for the first time. Not the version where help was coming soon, but the version where help was coming eventually. And eventually had teeth in a wadi with an unknown number of shooters in the dark. "Copy, Larkspur," Redmond said finally, and his voice had changed in a way June recognized immediately, the sound of a young man setting down the hope of rescue and picking up the harder, more useful tool of his own resolve. "What do you need from us? Over." "I need your exact position relative to the culvert, down to the meter if you can give it to me, because I'm about to walk your mortar section through an illumination mission. And if I'm going to light up that wadi so your Marines can see their footing and the enemy can't use the dark as cover." This was where the night's texture shifted, because what June did next was not something that could be taught quickly, and it was the exact skill that had made the name Vesper mean something to a generation of Marines, to coordinating an illumination mission in support of a unit in imminent danger, in the dark, over a degraded radio link, while that unit's ranking Marine had approximately 4 months of leadership experience and a wounded man for a clock, required holding an enormous amount of information in your head at once. Grid coordinates. The mortar section's exact tube position back at Larkspur, the ballistic arc a mortar round travels compared to the flatter trajectory of direct fire, the specific hazards of dropping an illumination round too close to friendly positions. The wind that was still gusting hard enough to push a parachute-suspended flare meaningfully off its intended point of function, and June held all of it the way some people hold a favorite piece of music, completely without visible effort, while also holding a steady, reassuring tone for the frightened young corporal on the other end of the link. "Fire, direction center, this is Larkspur Actual. I have a fire mission, over," she said, switching for a moment to the internal net that connected her to the 2 mortar tubes dug in behind the outpost's eastern berm. Actually bothered to ask her once what she used to do, and had gotten enough of an answer to know better than to question her now, responded immediately with the crisp readiness of someone who trusted the voice giving him numbers. "Larkspur, fire. Direction center, send it over." "Illumination mission grid follows," June said, and read off a 6-digit grid reference pulled from a map she had spent 14 months quietly memorizing during long, uneventful night shifts, cross-referenced against Redmond's last reported position. 1 round illumination, height of burst 200 meters, adjust fire, over. Larkspur, fire, direction center, understood. 1 round illumination, height of burst 200, adjust fire, ready, over. "Fire," June said, and there was a pause of perhaps 20 seconds, the specific taut silence of a night watch floor, waiting to hear whether a piece of falling machinery 100 meters up was about to save 12 lives or complicate them. And then Redmond's voice came back on, and for the first time, "Larkspur, Reaper 1, 3. We have illumination. It's good. It's lighting the whole wadi. We can see the drainage cut clear now. Over. Copy. Good effect, June said, already calculating the next adjustment. Because a single illumination round burns for less than a minute before it falls and the darkness closes back in, and the entire skill of an illumination mission. Time to keep a contested piece of ground lit continuously, without wasting ammunition, the mortar section did not have an unlimited supply. Fire direction center, adjust fire, repeat mission at 30-second intervals, 4 rounds over. And so it went, round after round, blooming into cold, white light above the wadi. At intervals June counted in her head with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything else. Each flare buying the patrol a slice of visibility to move by, each gap between flares a held breath across the whole operations center. By 21:30 hours, Redmond had gotten all 12 of his Marines, 11 able-bodied, and 1 wounded but ambulatory with support, into the drainage cut June had described to him, and the volume of incoming fire had noticeably decreased. Not because the enemy had lost interest, but because the illumination had cost them the one advantage the darkness had been giving them, the ability to maneuver unseen. This was, June knew, the moment when a fight like this one either began to stabilize or began to get worse in a new way. And it was Vance's 21:30 time check that told her which one was happening. Larkspur, Reaper, this is Vance, status check, came the young Lance Corporal's voice, weaker now, the strain of blood loss beginning to show through even his determined steadiness. We're in the cut, 12 packs accounted for. I say again, 12 packs, that's 11 up and 1 wounded, that's me. Still talking, still here. Time is 21. Copy your status, Lance Corporal. You're doing outstanding work, June said. And she meant every word of it, because she had spent enough of her career around wounded men doing exactly this, holding onto a task, a number, a small piece of order to know precisely how much it cost him to keep his voice level, and precisely how much it mattered that he did. Corporal Redmond, I need eyes on the eastern berm, now that you have some light and cover. Tell me what you're seeing. Over. What Redmond reported next was the piece of the night's math that made everything before it look almost simple. Not 1, but 2 elements of enemy fighters. 1 at the original tree line to the north, and a second previously unseen group that had used the storm's cover to reposition along the eastern berm. Close enough now, within what June's practiced eye put at less than 150 meters off the drainage cut, that any fire mission targeting them would fall well inside the distance the Marine Corps' own fire support doctrine defined as danger close. The zone in which supporting fire lands close enough to friendly positions that the risk to those very Marines from their own supporting arms becomes a serious and named hazard rather than a theoretical one. Captain Tice, still standing at the edge of the comms desk, absorbed this new grid reference over June's shoulder and felt something close to physical dread settle into his chest, because he understood better than most people in that operations center exactly what June was about to be asked to do and exactly how much could go wrong doing it. A danger close fire mission requires the controller to explicitly acknowledge, out loud on the record, that they are accepting the risk of dropping ordnance close enough to friendly troops that error has almost no margin, and it requires a level of confidence in your own calculations that very few people in any uniform. He opened his mouth to say something. He was not entirely sure what, and June spoke before he could. "Captain, I know what you're about to say, and I need you to trust me the way I need Corporal Redmond to trust me," she said, not looking up from the map she had unfolded across the desk, tracing the eastern berm's position with one steady finger. "I have run closer missions than this one, in worse wind than this one, and I am not going to guess. I am going to calculate, and then I am going to be right, because being right, if you want to relieve me, this is the moment to do it, because after this call, there's no taking it back. Over to you." Tice looked at her for a long moment, at the calm hands, the unhurried voice, the total absence of the kind of bravado that worries experienced officers, far more than confidence does. And he thought about the fact that in 6 hours of the worst radio traffic he had heard in his career, not once been wrong about a single piece of terrain or timing that could later be checked against a map. He thought about the 12 names on the personnel roster, taped to the wall beside the radio, each one belonging to somebody's son, and he made the decision that would earn him, later, more respect from his own command than almost anything else he did during his time at Larkspur. "Do it," he said. "It's your call." June nodded once and keyed the internal net. "Fire Direction Center. This is Larkspur Actual. Danger close fire mission. I say again, danger close. Distance to friendlies approximately 140 meters. Requesting acknowledgement of risk before I authorize over." Larkspur, Fire Direction Center, acknowledge danger close. 140 meters to friendlies standing by for grid and adjustment. Over, came the sergeant's voice, and June could hear, even through the radio's compressed static, the specific tightness that entered a professional's voice at a moment like this one. The sound of a man trusting a colleague with something that could not be walked back. What followed was 4 minutes of the most demanding kind of quiet, methodical work June had done in over a decade. Grid coordinates, read and confirm twice. A wind correction recalculated on the fly when a fresh gust of the tail end of the dust storm pushed through the area. A adjustment fire called with a deliberately conservative first round, designed to walk the impact toward the target from a safer starting distance rather than risk an aggressive first shot landing too close. And Redmond's voice, on the other end of the link, reading back his patrol's exact position one final time, so there could be no possible confusion about where his Marines were crouched in that drainage cut with their heads down. "Fire," June said, and the entire operations center held its breath with her. The round landed, by every subsequent account logged that night, almost exactly where June had placed it, close enough to the repositioned element on the eastern berm to break their cohesion and drive them back from the range at which they could effectively engage the drainage cut. Too far enough from Redmond's Marines that not one of them suffered so much as a scratch from their own supporting fire. Redmond's voice, when it came back on the net, had a tremor in it that had nothing to do with fear of the enemy. "Larkspur, Reaper 1-3, that was right on top of them. They're pulling back off the berm. I say again, they are pulling back. Good effect. Danger, close confirmed, safe. All my Marines. Still up, over." A pause, and then quieter, almost to himself, but caught by the open mic anyway. How is she doing this? By midnight, The immediate threat to Redmond's patrol had eased into something more like a long, tense standoff than an active firefight. The enemy element pulled back to a harassing distance, from which they occasionally probed with sporadic fire, but no longer pressed a close assault. Less dramatic work that mattered just as much as the fire missions. Rotating illumination on a schedule calculated to conserve the mortar section's dwindling supply of rounds, while still denying the enemy the full cover of darkness, walking Redmond through a careful, staged consolidation of his position that put his most experienced remaining Marines on the most likely avenues of approach, and checking in with Ollie Vance every 15 minutes without fail. Because she understood something that the mission logs would never fully capture, that a wounded man, given a job to do, survives the night differently than a wounded man left simply to suffer through it. Larkspur, this is Vance, came the 0015 check, the words a little slurred. Now, blood loss and cold and hours of adrenaline crash, all working against him at once. Status, 12 packs all accounted for. I'm still here, ma'am. Over. I hear you, Lance Corporal, and you're doing exactly what I need you to do, June said, and something in her voice in that moment, a warmth she allowed herself only in the smallest doses, careful never to let it curdle into the kind of pity that would insult a Marine trying this hard to hold himself together, made Captain Tice, still standing nearby, though he had long since stopped hovering with suspicion and had started, without quite admitting it to himself, simply watching her work the way a much younger officer watches a master of a craft, glance over at her with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last several hours from doubt into something closer to awe. Corporal Redmond, I want you rotating your Marines on watch in pairs so nobody runs on empty. And I want Lance Corporal Vance kept warm and kept talking. We are past the halfway point of this night. The math is getting better, not worse. Over. It was not strictly guaranteed to be true when she said it. The dust storm had not yet broken. The QRF remained blocked at the wash crossing, and the enemy element to the north had not withdrawn. Only quieted, but June had learned across a long career that there was a difference between false comfort and earned confidence. And what she gave Redmond in that transmission was the second kind, a genuine, calculated read of a situation that actually was, by every measurable factor she was tracking, trending towards survival rather than away from it. Delivered in a voice designed to give a frightened 22-year-old corporal exactly the steadiness he needed to keep making good decisions for 5 more hours. Those 5 hours contained their own smaller crises, each one handled with the same unhurried precision. A moment around 0140, when a probing burst of fire clipped the edge of the drainage cut and sent 2 Marines briefly scrambling before Redmond, coached in real time by June's voice in his ear, got back into position and returned fire in a controlled volley that discouraged any further probe from that direction. A stretch around 0230 when the mortar section's illumination rounds ran low enough that June had to recalculate her lighting schedule to stretch the remaining rounds across the darkest, most dangerous hours before dawn rather than the hours immediately following midnight, a piece of resource math that would have been invisible to anyone not doing the calculation themselves, but that meant the difference between a patrol with usable light at 0500 when a tired mind is most likely to make a fatal mistake, and a patrol that had burned through its illumination too early and was left blind exactly when blindness was most dangerous. And there was the moment somewhere around 0300 when Captain Tice, his earlier hostility, long since dissolved into something he would later have difficulty describing except as professional humility. "Miss Halloran," he said quietly, careful not to interrupt the rhythm of her work, "who taught you to do this?" June did not look away from the radio, but something in her face shifted. "A long time ago, in a place with a worse dust storm than this one," she said. "I'll tell you the rest of it in the morning, Captain, if there's a morning worth telling it in. Right now, I need you to get me an updated status on that wash crossing, because if it's cleared even partially by 0500, I want the QRF moving the second there's enough daylight for them to see the ground in front of their tires." Tice, who by 0300 had stopped needing to be told twice, went to make the call. At 0415, Ollivance's time check came through weaker than any before it, his voice thinned by 10 hours of blood loss and cold, and the specific exhaustion of a body that has spent all night fighting 2 battles at once. Larkspur, this is Vance. Status: 12 packs. All a pause that went on a half-second too long. Long enough that June's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the handset, the only outward sign in 10 hours that the composure she gave everyone else had a cost she was paying somewhere out of sight. All accounted for, time is 0415. Still here. "I hear you, Ollie," June said, using his first name for the first time all night, a small deliberate breach of radio formality that she judged correctly would do more for him in that moment than any amount of procedure. "You listen to me. The storm's breaking. I can see it on the anemometer readout right now. The wind's already down 8 knots from an hour ago. QRF is going to be moving within the hour, and air. You have done everything right tonight, and I need you to hold on for just a little while longer, because I am not losing a Marine after everything you have already survived. Do you copy that?" There was a long pause, and then, very quietly, almost too quiet for the radio to carry it. "Cleanly copy Larkspur. Holding." The dust storm broke, in the end, a little after 0500, the wind dying down across the desert in the specific sudden way such storms often do, as if some enormous unseen hand had simply lifted itself away, and within 20 minutes, finally able to cross the wash at the reduced water level the receding storm had left behind, was moving hard toward the wadi with headlights blazing against the graying dawn. June coordinated the link-up with the same unhurried precision she had brought to every hour before it, walking the QRF's lead vehicle through the final approach using the same terrain knowledge she had used to walk Redmond's patrol into the drainage cut 10 hours earlier, until the moment came at 0552 hours, when Corporal Cole Redmond's voice came back on the net, carrying something that had not been in it once during the entire night. Relief, plain. "Larkspur, Reaper 1-3, be advised, QRF has link-up. I say again, we have link-up, all 12 packs present. One urgent surgical and stable requesting to close this net, and thank you, ma'am, for every single word of tonight." June closed her eyes for 1 second, the same 1 second she had allowed herself 10 hours earlier, and this time it was not to clear her mind, but simply to feel, fully and privately, the specific quiet weight of 12 men who were alive, because a voice had refused to let them stop believing they could be. Copy Reaper 1-3. Well done tonight, all of you, she said. Get your wounded Marine to the surgeons and get some rest, Larkspur. Out. The column rolled through Outpost Larkspur's gate a little over an hour later, dust-caked vehicles trailing a low haze of settling grit in the pale gold light of a morning that felt to everyone who had spent the night listening to that radio, faintly unreal in its ordinariness. And among the men who climbed down from those vehicles, great temple figure whose presence at Larkspur that morning was, strictly speaking, a coincidence of timing, Sergeant Major Aldo Reyes had arrived the previous afternoon on an unrelated logistics visit and had spent the entire night in the operations center, arms crossed, saying almost nothing, listening to 10 hours of radio traffic with the particular focused stillness of a man who had spent 30 years around fire support nets and understood better than almost anyone else in that room exactly what he was hearing. Reyes had not said a word during the Danger Close mission, had not said a word during the illumination sequence, had not said a word through any of the 10 hours of quiet, precise, unhurried command that had kept 12 Marines alive through a night that should, by every reasonable measure, have cost at least several of their lives. But somewhere around 300, listening to the cadence of that voice, the specific rhythm of the pauses, the particular economy of the phrasing, a cadence he had not heard live in over a decade, but had heard hundreds of times on cracked, decade-old training recordings that every fire support Marine of his generation had been made to study until they could recite entire transmissions from memory. A suspicion had begun to form in the back of his mind that he had, for 10 hours, refused to fully credit because it seemed on its face impossible. Now, standing in the operations center, in the clear light of morning, watching a gray-haired woman in a worn contractor fleece, calmly logging the final entries of the night's traffic into a binder as though she had simply worked a routine shift, Sergeant Major Aldo Reyes walked directly up to the comms desk, came to a stop in front of her, and asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried a formal weight that made Captain Tice look up sharply from across the room. "I need to know your call sign from last night, not your name." "Your call sign?" June looked up at him, and for the first time in 14 months at Outpost Larkspur, something in her face allowed a flicker of the person she had been before this quiet boasting, before the coffee pot and the chipped mug and the careless nickname worn smooth by repetition. She held his gaze the way she had held Bram Tice's gaze 10 hours earlier when he had ordered her off the net with the same unhurried, unbothered certainty. And she said the one word that stopped every conversation in the operations center, dead. "Vesper." The silence that followed lasted almost 4 full seconds, and in those 4 seconds Aldo Reyes did something that not one person in that room, least of all June herself, expected. A 31-year Marine, decorated twice for actions that had nothing to do with fire support and everything to do with dragging wounded men out of places they should not have survived, came to rigid attention and rendered a slow, deliberate, full salute to a 51-year-old contractor in a fleece jacket, the kind of salute normally reserved for flag-draped coffins and visiting generals. And he held it for a long moment before he spoke again. "Ma'am, I sat in a schoolhouse classroom 22 years ago and listened to a recording of your voice calling a fire mission during the worst 3 days of a siege that killed half the Marines in that position. And some of us honestly thought that story was half legend, something the instructors told us to make a point stick. I had no idea. He lowered the salute slowly, and something in his composed, weathered face cracked into an expression that had no place in a 31-year career's careful reserve. I had absolutely no idea I was standing across a comms desk from Vesper for 6 hours and calling you radio girl in my own head half the night. Corporal Cole Redmond, still dust-streaked and hollow-eyed from a night that had aged him permanently in ways no one in that room could yet fully measure, stood a few feet away with Lance Corporal Ollie Vance on a stretcher beside him, an IV line already running into the young Marine's arm, both of them close enough to hear every word, and Redmond's face. Hearing that single word Vesper did something that would stay with everyone watching for a long time afterward. Recognition, disbelief, and then a kind of grateful, overwhelmed understanding, all moving across it at once. The voice that had walked him through becoming a leader in the space of 10 brutal hours had belonged to someone whose recordings he himself had studied in a classroom less than 2 years earlier without ever imagining he would owe his life to the woman behind them. Redmond started, and then seemed to run out of words entirely and simply extended his hand instead, and June took it and held it for a moment longer than a handshake strictly required, because she understood in the way that only someone who has spent a career doing this work exactly what that grip meant from a young man who had spent a night believing he might not survive to shake anyone's hand again. "You did the hard part, Corporal," she told him quietly, so it would not become a spectacle for the rest of the room. "You're the one who kept 12 Marines moving in the dark, with an RPG round still ringing in your ears. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, including yourself." Ollie Vance, pale and exhausted on the stretcher, but conscious enough to have heard everything, managed a weak crooked smile as the corpsman prepared to move him toward the aid station. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "every 15 minutes, I kept my time checks. Every single one," June said, crouching briefly beside the stretcher so he wouldn't have to raise his voice. "You were the best clock I've ever worked off of. Lance Corporal, go get that leg looked at. That's an order from Radio Girl." He laughed, a small, cracked, exhausted sound, and it was, in its own modest way, the most honest tribute anyone paid her that entire morning. Captain Dramatized found her an hour later after the wounded had been moved, after the debrief had been logged, after Sergeant Major Reyes had spent a long, quiet conversation with her in the corner of the operations center that no one else was invited to overhear, and he did something he had not expected. That morning, that he would ever find himself doing, he apologized. "I ordered you off that net," he said. "Twice you did," June agreed, without rancor, wiping down the comms desk with the same unhurried care she brought to everything else. "I was wrong. You were doing your job the way you were trained to do it, Captain, with the information you had," June said. "That's not the same thing as being wrong. It's the same thing as not having the whole picture. Now you do?" She held out her hand and he shook it, and something settled between them that would make the rest of her time at Larkspur, however long, that turned out to be considerably different than the 14 months that had come before it. By the time the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline and burned the last haze of the dust storm out of a sky gone hard and blue, Outpost Larkspur had already begun, in the way that outposts do, to reshape the story of the previous night into something more manageable, more repeatable, a version that would get passed from marine to marine over the following days until it had the smooth, worn edges of a story told many times. The wadi, the 12 packs, the danger close mission, the call sign that stopped a decorated sergeant major cold in the middle of an operations center. Some of the details would sharpen with retelling, some would blur, but the essential shape of it, the thing that mattered, would not change. That a woman everyone had dismissed as radio, Grandma had spent a night proving, hour by hour, grid by grid, time check by time check, that the most dangerous person in a fight is not always the one carrying the rifle, and that a voice, calm enough and skilled enough and certain enough, could be worth more than every gun in that wadi combined. June Halloran did not attend the informal gathering the following evening, where half the outpost, in low voices over coffee that someone else had finally made for once, traded versions of the story and argued good-naturedly about which detail was the most impressive. The illumination sequence, the danger close call, the terrain memory that had seemed, to men who did not know her history, almost supernatural. She was back at the night desk at a usual hour, in a usual fleece, with a usual chipped white mug, because the traffic still needed logging and the coffee still needed making, and a 51-year-old woman who had spent 30 years exit from the 14 months of nights that had come before it. What was different, in small ways, that would only become fully visible over the following weeks, was the way people crossed the operations center now. A little more quietly past her desk, a little more carefully with their coffee mugs, the nickname Radio Girl still occasionally used, but stripped almost overnight of every trace of the condescension it had once carried, until it became, without anyone quite deciding to make it so, something closer to an honorific. Cole Redmond, promoted not long after, in recognition of a night that had tested him well beyond his rank and found him equal to it, made a habit of stopping by the comms desk before his own shifts to ask her, without fail, how she was doing, a small courtesy that meant more to both of them than either would have said out loud. Ollie Vance, recovering steadily from a wound that would leave him with a scar and a story, but no lasting damage, sent word through the aid station, once he was well enough to speak clearly, that he intended to keep his time checks running for the rest of his career, 15 minutes at a time. Because a woman on a radio had taught him that discipline could be a kind of courage all its own. And Sergeant Major Aldo Reyes, before he left Outpost Larkspur to continue the logistics visit that had brought him there in the first place, made one final stop at the comm shack in the early morning quiet before the desk traffic picked up, and found June exactly where he expected to find her, pouring a cup of coffee into the same chipped white mug. Her hair pulled back in the same simple clip, her face carrying no particular weight from the recognition of the previous day, as though the entire episode had already folded itself neatly back into the long, quiet continuity of her ordinary life. He did not salute her again. That had already been said, fully and completely, in the operations center the morning before. But he stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and said the only thing that still needed saying. "They're going to remember this for the rest of their careers, ma'am. All 12 of them." Every young Marine who ever sits a fire support course from here on is going to hear a new story added to the old recordings. And it's going to be about a night in a wadi and a call sign nobody thought was still active. June looked up from her coffee, and something in her expression was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one that it changed her whole face for a moment, the tired lines around her eyes softening into something warmer. "Let them tell it," she said. "Just make sure they remember the corporal who took command with an RPG still ringing in his ears, and the lance corporal who kept his time checks with a tourniquet on his leg. Because that's the part of the story that actually matters. The rest of it is just a woman who happened to remember a map." Reyes studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. The particular nod of a man who understands he is looking at someone who has never once needed him to understand her, and left her to her coffee and her quiet desk and the long, unremarkable stretch of an ordinary morning that she had, in her own way, more than... If there is a single truth in this story worth carrying with you past the last line of it, it might be this. The people who save you are so rarely the people you expect, and the ones who are underestimated the hardest are so often the ones who could teach the rest of us everything we think we already know. June Halloran never fired a shot that night. She never left the comm shack, never touched a weapon heavier than a coffee mug, never set foot outside the wire. And she brought 12 men home anyway, because her weapon was a voice that did not shake, a memory that did not fail, and a discipline that 30 years of hard-earned mastery had made unbreakable. And because somewhere in this world, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only reason anyone else gets to see morning. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath through those grid calls and those 15-minute time checks right alongside Redmond and Vance, take a second to like this video and subscribe for more stories like June's, stories about the ones who get overlooked, right up until the moment they prove they were the most dangerous person in the room the entire time. And before you go, tell us in the comments, if you were pinned down in that wadi and heard a voice like June's come across the net, calm and certain, in the middle of the worst night of your life, would you have questioned it, or would you have trusted it the way Cole Redmond did, completely from the very first transmission? We read every comment, and we want to hear which part of June's night stayed with you the longest. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.